I'm lucky to have a job, and I feel a bit guilty about the youngsters not leaving school and having... Maybe I only do a little part-time job, but I would willingly give it up for a youngster that's leaving school. I think that is atrocious.
Nothing no more soul-destroying than watching young people. I have a daughter now who's about to leave school, and of course, like anybody else, I've been sort of pushing a bit for education to try and get a job. And her attitude is, and it's not a belligerent attitude, is I shan't get a job, why should I bother?
I'm glad I am bringing children up today.
Yeah, I am. I think it's awful.
I think it's difficult for them now, though, more difficult than it was for us, really.
It's a pity they can't find jobs for these youngsters that are all leaving school, I don't know.
Yes, it must be a tragedy, really.
Oh, it is, yeah.
Because, I mean, they must feel dejected about it all. I mean, I wouldn't like to think I was starting my life again.
The similarities between the state of the British economy in the 80s and the Great Depression of the 30s are painfully obvious. Above all, recent years have seen a return to mass unemployment on a scale which it once seemed had been relegated to the history books. The 30s, a decade without hope. A decade of poverty, anger, frustration. Factories closed, shipyards closed. Workers thrown onto the dole. Urged on by leaders such as Ernest Bevin, the unemployed marched on London. George Lansbury added his powerful voice. In alarm, the government called out the police. There were ugly confrontations. Today, 50 years on, the unemployed are again on the march. In the 30s, there were 3 million out of work. There are 3 million out of work now. In some ways, it was much worse then. Perhaps in others, it's worse now. Mabel Harrison, a Yorkshire local historian, remembers just what it was like.
You started working in the mill.
Yes.
What sort of age would you be there?
When I was 14.
Yeah.
I left school at 14. That was Easter 1930. And I started as a nipper up at the old shed. And that's an apprentice weaver.
So, thinking back to the unemployment in the 30s, how is it worse than it is today?
Well, poverty. I mean, it was real poverty. When you did work, you only had enough money to sort of keep you in food and pay the rent. You didn't have much for clothes. There was no fashion-conscious children in those days, or teenagers. You just wore what you had given, passed on from somebody else. And children went to school in patched jackets and patched trousers and old boots, and that was how it went.
And you couldn't rely much on the dole and social security, presumably.
Oh, well, the dole didn't really keep them in rent and food. It was a struggle. I mean, mind you, the women were good. They knew how to make ends meet. They hadn't the convenience food of today, a few bones and vegetables, and they made a stew and meat and potato pie, which was mostly potato, and that's how it went on. There were slates in the shops, you know, where they ticked up, and when they were out of work, they got into a lot of debt. Then when they had work, they tried to pay it off, but I think they were perpetually in debt, really. Until the First World War, women never worked. They had to be very poor to the married woman to work. And then when the men went to war, all the women took their jobs. And of course, the mill owners realised they were on a good thing. And when the war ended, they didn't set the husbands on when they came back from the war. The women were paid less money. But they used to get 2 or 3 months a year on night shift when they wanted an order out. And then you'd get the woman working during the day and the man working during the night. And that's how it went, well, up to about 1935, I should think.
And yet, during the 25 years following the Second World War, it seemed that mass unemployment had been conquered once and for all. chiefly by applying the policies based on the thinking of this man, John Maynard Keynes, who as long ago as 1936 published this book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Not by the sound of it a best-selling title, but a book which was to have profound significance. The general theory pointed to two conclusions. Firstly, that full employment was not a likely outcome in an unregulated economy. Secondly, that if we wanted full employment, it could be achieved by governments intervening in an appropriate way. Keynes's basic proposition was that jobs depended on spending, that the number of people in work was determined by the extent to which what they produced was then bought.
Wages get spent on one thing or another. One person's spending is another person's income. Spender and seller alike are better off. Shopkeepers have certainly benefited. A high level of spending means general prosperity in the economy.
But of course the opposite was also true.
The effect of factory closures, of people being thrown out of work, would spread throughout the economy. With a cumulative decline in total spending, still more jobs would be lost.
So the question that concerned Keynes was why spending might not be at a level high enough to create jobs for all who wanted them. And his answer was along these lines.
Suppose that if all the resources in the economy, land, labour and capital, were fully employed, then this block represents the value of full employment output, all the goods and services that can be produced. Then Keynes said that if full employment was to be achieved and maintained, this output would have to be bought, and that depended on the level of spending in the economy. There are four main types of spending. First, there's consumption.
Investment in factories and machines. Foreigners spending on our exports minus what we spend on imports. And of course, government is a big spender. Money for defence, for social services, for nationalised industries. If our total spending on consumption, on investment, on exports minus imports, and spending by government, what we call aggregate demand, is not sufficient to buy all the output produced with full employment, then producers have unsold stocks of goods. Government would have to intervene to prevent unemployment.
A shortfall of spending below the amount needed to buy full employment output is called a deflationary gap. And Keynes said that if we wanted full employment, then it was up to governments to fill this gap by monetary and fiscal policy to increase spending.
Keynes said that a deflationary gap like this was all too likely in an unregulated economy, that there's no reason why all the spending plans of millions of consumers, firms, foreigners and government itself should add up to just the right total. And if they didn't, then government should pull its monetary lever, resulting in lower interest rates and easier credit, or the government should pull its fiscal lever with lower taxes and public expenditure, to either encourage the private sector to spend more, or if that wasn't enough to fill the gap, to do the job itself through deficit financing, with the state spending more than it received in taxation on, for example, public works like new road construction or house building. And when these ideas were put into practice during the post-war years, they seemed to work remarkably well. The high level of unemployment in the 1930s fell dramatically, and between 1942 and 1970 never rose above 3%. Never before had there been a period when such a high proportion of the workforce consistently found employment. It was a time when those leaving school or college found jobs waiting for them, when people felt confident in moving from one job to another, when employment was secure. So just how easy was it for people to get jobs at that time?
Well, the war was on. It was 1944. Pretty easy, I think.
Oh, but easy. You could just come out of one job into another, no problem.
Well, there's no comparison compared with now. In the 50s, 60s, we left a job, walked off a job and got a job the following day.
I started in the mines, 49, no problems whatsoever, getting a job. All my friends, I know everybody, all could get jobs easy.
I had 10 weeks off. When my money ran out, I went and got a job. I've never been out of work since. I started here. But kids these days, they don't even know what it is to have a job. Never mind walk out of a job and have a rest. They have a rest now, all right, a long one.
But there was no hanging about for jobs in the 60s. Then there was a mood of general euphoria, of self-congratulation at a great achievement.
Never grow less.
1960, and we have never had it so good. There is full employment in the factories. Such unemployment as there is mostly represents people going from one job to another. A transition swiftly accomplished in this day and age. This time of work for all, by the well-oiled machinery of the employment exchanges. Even for the elderly, there is work nowadays if they want it. How different from the bad days they remember so well. Now, jobs for everybody. No wasting of men's lives in idleness. The new estates and new towns have turned the country's back on the hovels of the past and on the lost years. Those evils must never return.
So, 25 years of unemployment below 3%. From this point of view, an astonishing success story. So what went wrong? Why, having apparently learned how to get rid of unemployment, did we allow it to rise again to its present level? Well, in the first place, Keynesianism proved to have some serious limitations. In practice, not all unemployment was eliminated by the Keynesian technique of controlling the level of demand. Even in the heyday of full employment, many regions in Britain suffered persistently higher than average unemployment, and pumping in more demand didn't solve the problem.
If, for example, demand was increased by handouts in a depressed region, then people there might not spend their higher incomes on local goods. Instead, the beneficiaries might be producers from elsewhere, with spending being on goods from the prosperous regions or on imports.
So employment didn't increase because unemployment of this kind wasn't due to demand deficiency, but to the failure of the regions to attract businesses, factories and machines for the workers to work with. That was one limit of Keynesianism.
Another problem was the crudeness of Keynesian techniques for manipulating spending. Suppose, for example, a chancellor thought that there was a deflationary gap and he wanted to fill it to restore full employment. Then what he'd do is to pull the levers. Cut interest rates, cut taxes, give investment grants and so on. And you can see what happens.
Well, so far it isn't working at all. Now spending is increasing. But hold on, it's rising too much. Now it's gone too far. And those were the weaknesses of Keynesian techniques. You couldn't be sure when they would work.
Or by how much. They could lead to increased spending in excess of the value of full employment output. So that increased spending pulls up prices, an inflationary gap causing demand pull inflation.
It was very difficult to fine-tune spending to just the right level. Too little meant unemployment. Too much meant higher prices.
So two problems of Keynesianism were regional and structural unemployment, which couldn't be dealt with by just pumping in more spending, and the imprecision of the Keynesian weapons of control, which meant either that employment wasn't as high as the government wanted or that prices were rising. A third problem during these years was that prices could rise for another reason.
Prices are made up of the various costs that go into them. There's labour costs, wages and salaries. There's the cost of raw materials, capital costs, interest and depreciation, taxes paid to governments, and finally profits. Any of these increasing, for example, a rise in the cost of imported materials, can lead to producers marking up the prices they charge.
And as costs rise, inevitably prices are raised to cover them.
The result is cost-push inflation.
For all these reasons, Keynesianism came increasingly under fire. In particular, it was alleged that it was inherently inflationary. Earlier, we were comparing the 30s and the 80s, but a big difference between the two periods is that in the early 30s, prices were falling. More recently, of course, they've been rising, at times very sharply indeed. The result of this was that governments began to change their policy priorities, getting worried about rising prices to the point where control of inflation became a more important objective than full employment. By the late 60s and the early 70s, it was felt that running the economy somewhat below full employment would eliminate demand inflation and reduce cost inflationary pressures. World factors, too, have helped to increase unemployment, mainly because of the shift in purchasing power caused by the massive oil price increases of the early 70s. And most important, governments have come round to the view that Keynesian policies fueled inflation as governments printed too much money to finance high spending levels.
Britain has lived for too long on borrowed time, borrowed money, borrowed ideas. And we live in too troubled a world to be able to promise that in a matter of months, or even in a couple of years, that we shall enter the promised land.
Mr. Callaghan, addressing the Labour Party conference in 1976, questioning the basis of past policies.
For too long, perhaps ever since the war, we've postponed facing up to fundamental choices and fundamental changes in our society and in our economy. That is what I mean when I say we've been living on borrowed time.
Increasingly, governments became converted to the idea that inflation was the major evil and that rising prices were caused by too much money. There are those who say that present mass unemployment is mainly the result of attempts to cut public spending and reduce inflation by controlling the money supply. It's the nature and effects of these policies that we'll be looking at in later programs.